where I started to see more and more, like as I finished this master's in conservation program, as I was hearing about examples that I was feeling really inspired by, they were all examples led by Indigenous communities that hadn't forgotten that connection, that had, despite all of the violence of, continued colonialism, had maintained that connection as kin. And I felt like I want to get behind that. I want to support those efforts.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome. Today's conversation is with Jodi Gustafson of River Collective. River is an international community of people who are seeking to strengthen and revitalize Indigenous approaches to regeneration. In this discussion, we cover themes like Indigenous organizing, bridging the world of conservation, working across multiple geographies, and really incorporating and elevating the voice of youth in this work. To me, what Jodi really embodies is an alternative approach to what it means to run an organization and a fellowship, and an entirely different set of theories of change around climate action. This conversation was recorded at Bioneers in April 2023. I hope you enjoy it. Jodi Gustafson. We are here with Jodi Gustafson. Jodi is a member of the River Collective. Thanks, Jodi.
Good to be here, Matthew.
So what is River Collective?
So River is a collective of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working together from several distinct leverage points to advance Indigenous stewardship efforts. And River stands for Revitalizing Indigenous Virtues for Earth's Regeneration.
And I understand that virtues and values was a bit of a discussion point. Why did you choose virtues as the V in the acronym?
We did because we followed our elder, Mark Wedge, who told us to. But essentially, the reasoning for that was that Mark Wedge, or Angushu, he's a Tlingit elder who's been really, really good to us in River and kind of guiding us in a good way. And he explained that values, can be, he said, I can value money. I can value, there was all kinds of things that he talked about, materialistic kind of things that we can value. But he said virtues, those come from sacred teachings. Virtues are differ from values in that way in the origin of virtues. So he said we had it first as values, and he said, no, you need to change that to virtues. So we did what he said. Nice.
And where does this honoring of our elders and this communal approach to starting a new project and this entire theory of change, I'm so interested to unpack, like, why this expression of the work?
Yeah, I think that for so many of us, I'll just speak for myself, but have been on, different journeys. Like within River, we all come from such different walks of life and, backgrounds in terms of, where we're from, in terms of our ancestry, in terms of our life experiences and fields, that we've pursued. But we all have come to this place of recognition of what we want to uphold in our work from different leverage points. And speaking from my own journey, it's come from, I was born and raised in what is today known as the Yukon in northern Canada, southern Shoshone homelands, and grew up there in a family really involved in environmental kind of conservation work. My dad was a conservation officer growing up, and so knew from a young age that I wanted to be involved in work for the earth, in conservation efforts. We had all kinds of orphaned and injured wildlife around the house and stuff as a kid that we'd look after. We had swan cygnets, like for a while we were looking after. We had all sorts of injured birds a lot of the time. And I remember, though, when I was about 7, I guess, Dad brought home a duck. There had been an oil spill off the Alaska Highway. Mm-hmm. And there was a duck brought home that was covered in oil. And he kind of just left me with that duck and said, okay, I have to go tend to the spill, but can you wash her? And so I did. And he or she, I'm not actually sure of the gender of the duck, but died in my hands. And as a 7-year-old, that had a pretty big impact on me, just in terms of how I think a real questioning. I remember asking why that happened, how that could be to happen, and how humans had allowed something like that to happen, and really trying to understand why people were so flippant, I think, about these things. And anyhow, fast forward many years later, and I ended up in conservation work and working in conservation because of, I think, largely how I had grown up and spending a lot of time outside and that kind of thing. But it was later, as I kind of got further down the track in conservation work, that I started to recognize the shortcomings of a lot of the mainstream conservation model as well, and why a lot of the approaches or strategies that were being embraced in the mainstream conservation world were not, I wasn't feeling inspired by a lot of them. And so it was this recognition. It was interesting because I went off to do this master's in conservation program that was wonderful, and I'm very appreciative for the program. But it was interesting after finishing that program, I didn't feel like there was any mainstream conservation organization that I felt inspired to work for. Like I felt jaded. I didn't feel, I wasn't feeling inspired to work for any of these things.
Were there aspects in particular that you felt either dissonant with or that were missing from the mainstream conservation movement?
Yeah. So what I did realize, I think, as I was able to, and sometimes, events happen in life and you don't really understand the impact of them until later, right? Like what it had on you. So it was interesting because I remember the summer before I went to do this master's program, I was working on engagement with First Nations on the Yukon River for salmon restoration strategy. And I remember being at a First Nation along the river there, and I had my typical sort of set of questions that I was asking in terms of to determine how to improve salmon restoration, my typical kind of Western set of questions, really. And I remember the man from the lands department there, he looked at me across the table and he said, the elders are crying, I finished that interview with this set of questions and went into my car and just burst into tears. But it was this I think what it was is I was obviously, there was a sadness in terms of recognition of what was happening, like what's happening with Yukon River salmon and the lower numbers, they're coming back in the disconnection. But also what it was this recognition of this, of my own disconnection, of like that breakage of the fact that these people, that these were salmon people, like that this First Nation had this deep relationship with these salmon, like as kin relatives, that somewhere along my line had been broken, like that I didn't have that same, that I wasn't crying like in the way that you do for a relative anymore. And that was when I started to, or like that relationship wasn't there. And I think that's when that, for me, I started to looking back, I think that I didn't realize at the time why that hit me so hard. But then reflecting years later, I started to recognize, and Mark Wedge, an elder from home who was really good to me and kind of took me under his wing when I was really trying to figure things out as to why I did feel so disheartened by the mainstream conservation movement. He explained to me that my whole education, like my whole life, had really only nurtured my half of myself, like my, physical and intellectual well-being, but my emotional and spiritual well-being hadn't been tended to really much at all. And I think that when we look at a lot of these mainstream or a lot of conservation efforts, again, like they're still tending to that mental, like side of things, but those deeper spiritual and emotional pieces, like that so many of us in the West have forgotten, aren't tended to. And where I started to see more and more, like as I finished this master's in conservation program, as I was hearing about examples that I was feeling really inspired by, they were all examples led by Indigenous communities, like that hadn't forgotten that connection, that had, despite all of the violence of, continued colonialism, had maintained that connection as kin. And I felt like I want to get behind that. I want to support those efforts. I want to support those efforts to do whatever I can from my, that's appropriate from my position, my positionality, to be able to enable them to steward their ancestral homelands in a good way. So that's where I really started to pivot my work, which the first thing to do when you pivot like that is to be quiet, is to just sit and learn and know your place. I think, and I had to do, and I'm still doing that to a degree, a lot of learning about about how to support in a good way. And it's something that I'm really, really trying to cultivate across the field of conservation as well.
Yeah, I can really relate to the mistakes that get made often in this realization that, wow, we have so much to learn from Indigenous cultures, and so much that can be enabled and supported by listening to these ancestral ways, and yet, fumbling in as a person that doesn't necessarily have as much context and understanding and background, and kind of putting my foot in my mouth more than one occasion. And I'm curious, like, what have you learned about that approach of listening and knowing your place? And how would you advise people that may be earlier on that journey to approach this conversation?
Well, I think it actually brings to a neat a neat juncture to talk about one of the offerings that we have at River that we've co-created together, that we're co-developing together, called Illuminating Worldviews.
Nice. That
we've been working on with a team with Dr. David McConville and different members of our working group. Matriki is also involved in this project. but we've got some of the Yukon First Nations climate fellows involved. And the purpose of Illuminating Worldviews are it takes participants on sort of a metaphorical journey of going down a river. And we have stopovers along the way. And the first module or first stopover of the journey is looking at who are you? It's looking at knowing yourself. Like, who are you really beyond a job title? Like, who are your people? Like, who are your homelands? Where do you come from? And where do you live now? Like, what are your responsibilities to that place? But the second place we go to is looking at what's a worldview anyway. So this recognition that for so many of us who are born into colonial realities, colonized realities, I think in the West we can grow up in a way where you don't recognize, like, you're a fish swimming in water, but you don't know what water is, and there can be, these systems that we live within have become so normalized as to become invisible, right? Like, and I think sometimes we can think that this is universal reason, a universal way of reasoning, but really, it's one worldview that came from a specific place, from actually quite a dark, unhealthy place when we look at where a lot of our Western, dominant legal governance systems and things have come from. So the second stopover is what's a worldview anyway. So that recognition that we don't live in a world of universal reason, and trying to really recognize that we each do have a worldview that comes from a distinct place. The third stopover is really looking at the history of the Western cosmovision. So a lot of what we don't learn about in schools, but like getting curious together in a good way about where did a lot of our governance structures and things come from? Like, what are those underlying assumptions and beliefs? And then after doing those three key pieces, then we flow more into looking at really contextualized, but more kin-centric ways of being, and depending on tailoring it with the local audience that we're working with in that specific place. And then, yes, other modules after that. But I think it's really important that we start there in that place of first reflection, because what I tend to see is that a lot of people who, especially with buzzwords coming out like from federal governments and stuff, at least in Canada, about bridging, knowledges, or moving forward with things like two-eyed seeing, is that you get people, and maybe the well-intentioned people, right? But in the private sector, in government, coming in and trying to fly straight into like two-eyed seeing. Okay, like, hey, we're gonna bridge knowledges. We're gonna, weave these two ways of being, and then quickly, I think those people realize, like, oh shoot, I know nothing about Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, or being. So then try to go, okay, I got to learn this, these things about Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being, which also puts burden on Indigenous peoples to share those things. But then they kind of tend to end there. And like those first three pieces of like, who am I? What's a worldview anyway? And where the history of the Western cosmovision, like that work ends up never being done. And so I think that what's important is that what I like about the approach that we're taking with Illuminating Worldviews is that we are doing that piece. And I think that it can be healing for people to know who they are as well. It can be traumatizing too, but I think it can also be liberating to know the origins of a lot of these systems that we navigate on a daily and where they do come from, because we're oftentimes not taught these things in school, unfortunately, not yet. But we're trying to change that.
I see. So really River is taking kind of an educational, exploratory journey approach to helping people step back and maybe start from a more appropriate place in this exploration. What is the expression of the work? Is it in-person events? Is it online webinars? Like, how does it show up?
So far we've been doing things. Yes, we've been really careful so far about how we've done things. And I think the approach with River in general is that we'll be kind of small and deep rather than wide and shallow. And so we've done a journey that was in the height of COVID. So we did with some government officials and a First Nations climate group that were keen to come together to work on a climate strategy. But we're coming from really different worldviews to a point that it was difficult to actually work together without without changing the foundational fabric of that relationship. So we did that one entirely online, which was interesting. I actually was surprised at how deep people could get on Zoom. Nice. I was shocked by that, actually. But I think it was also in the height of COVID, I think, when people were feeling a lot of disconnection. And so there was this willingness to maybe be a bit more vulnerable in places like that than maybe we would have seen without that. Mm-hmm. And then the other pilot that we've done so far was with a settler-founded conservation organization in Canada. And we did a combination. So we had a two-day in-person retreat and then with a series of online workshops after. But what we're working on now is creating a series of multimedia assets of films and animations to accompany some of the materials that David's been curating over the years. He's such a nerd. He's got this huge library of all this material that he's been digging into for such a long time. And we're like, hey, how do we use this? How do we use this in a way that actually supports this movement? So we're trying to get this in places where these conversations are being taken out of just academia or places like this where they tend to just be shelved and not particularly useful beyond that sphere of who can access those places, and then taking some of those core lessons into a place where most of us can actually understand or get a grasp on some of these teachings, because there's some really good stuff in there. So, and I hope that, and what we've heard so far is that, I guess I see this as being foundational to be able, there's some preparatory work for people who maybe do want to be able to I was going to say come to the table, but who do want to, come around, in circle, or with, who do want to collaborate in a good way with local people or with, communities, and just some of that foundational work that needs to be done beforehand beforehand to not cause harm. So that's what we're working. One of the things we're working towards. That's one of the streams of river, and then Matariki is really working hard on the other stream, the watershed. I'm not sure if she spoke about that place for knowledge sharing, healing and innovation, mostly among Indigenous peoples, to really share in wins, to share in common challenges, common opportunities, and just a space of celebration together, a space of healing together, but just providing that space as well. So she's curating that space more.
Nice. Yeah. And so you started River, the community started River a few years ago, right? What year was that?
Good question. I think it was around the time of the pandemic. So I guess we kind of really got going in 2020, I guess. Yeah.
And then your work has now flowed into a fellowship as well. So can you share a bit of what you're doing there and how that work came to be?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was so honored a few years ago. I was approached to support Jocelyn Jo Struck, or Dakalama is her Southern Shoshone name. And she's an incredible woman from home where I grew up. So I grew up in Southern Shoshone homelands. And Jocelyn, in support by the Council of Yukon First Nations and the Assembly of First Nations, Yukon region, and some other climate organizations, was looking to begin this Yukon First Nations Climate Action Fellowship to create a Yukon First Nations approach to climate action. And so I got asked to support Jocelyn with some of that work. So not being a Yukon First Nations person, I was supporting kind of behind the scenes the last couple years with that. And it was Oh my gosh, Matthew, it was life-changing. It was
Wow.
a life-changing experience. I still to this day, I take it really seriously that I was asked to support on that project. Like it was like such a huge honor and privilege for me. And the fellows, the young people who ended up working with, became some of my biggest teachers I've ever had in my life. And just, have changed my life in so many ways. So I'm, really, I feel like that was just such a gift. So to be given that opportunity to support that project. And they're just about to release publicly this Yukon First Nations Climate Vision and Action Plan. They've called the Reconnection Vision. They've taken such a heartful approach to climate action. And they have a space for everyone in their climate plan. And yeah, I'm really, really excited to see where it's going to go. So, that's all that work's about to come out now. But the last 2 years were, a huge journey on working to develop that in a way that was, different than maybe traditional, like not traditional, but in terms of, in ways of sort of dominant ways of development of climate plans that a lot of us have come to know. And so,
so this is really about finding young Indigenous land defenders, creating a fellowship context to bring them together. Roughly how many folks?
So we ended up having 13 fellows follow through the program.
And then that over a couple of years journey.
Yeah.
And that experience presumably was a combination of online and in-person events or meetings?
Yes, it was. Yes. So we had 13 young, incredible First Nations leaders, emergent leaders from across the Yukon come together, and they each working in their own unique fields. So such a diverse array of young people. But each, there's, hunters, some were parents, some were, policy, doing Indigenous governance and policy, language revitalizers, beaters, you name it, just a real array of young people. And come together. And we had an online curriculum for the first while, since we were in the height of COVID, and then in-person gatherings as well. And we ended up going through quite a different sort of curriculum, though, maybe than most people maybe would have taken with something like climate action. So we ended up really trying to destabilize, I guess, the way that climate change is thought about, and to really zoom out to allow their Yukon First Nations approach to blossom. Yeah.
I'm also really curious, this phrase reconnection. Like I don't hear that necessarily always in the same breath as climate action. Can you help me unpack that a bit more?
Yes, totally. Love that question. So I think what the fellows, like what we were hearing, the reasoning, and Shauna can speak more to this since she was actually there at this gathering. But
so we're going to interview Shauna, so people can watch that episode, and we'll put the links up.
Yes. But in February 2020, Yukon First Nations chiefs came together and signed a Yukon First Nations climate declaration. And the reasoning, and that was after the First Nation of Buntakwitchin and Old Crow had released an emergency declaration the year before. But the chiefs said that they wanted the approach to Yukon First Nations climate action to be youth-led. And they said, as I quote, because it is their future at stake, and they will inherit the decisions made now.
Wow.
So they wanted they wanted them to create this approach.
Rather than we know better because we're older.
Yeah, right? Like just that belief in their youth. So so that's how this fellowship came to be, and Jocelyn really bringing a lot of that forward in her very special way that really is a blend of. Jocelyn's a scientist. She's an Indigenous scientist. She's a water scientist, and also she is an incredibly spiritual person. She's a mother. She sings. She is so many things, and so I really want to hold Jocelyn up because she really brought this forward in this different way, this new but very old way of doing things. And so through this journey that we went on, what the fellows came to that they wanted to ultimately bring forward in terms of climate action was that reconnection is climate action. And so the theory of change that they've put forward in terms of how we even look at climate change is really different than how sort of we've come to look at it through this sort of dominant Western lens that tends to permeate most of the media. And I think, at least I know from what I've seen, a lot of climate plans tend to rely on consumer driven solutions, on solar panels, electric vehicles,
plastic bag reduction in the grocery store. Yeah.
And not to say that there isn't a place for those things. Like, there's definitely a place for those things. I don't want to completely poo-poo those things.
Yeah.
But I think that those, from what the fellows are bringing forward, is that those are only treating the symptoms of climate change, not the root cause.
Right.
Which they're saying is disconnection from all parts of ourselves, disconnection from each other, this disconnection from spirit, and disconnection from the land. And so they're saying that reconnection with all of those things that I said is climate action. That is climate action. And so that's there. It's a deep approach that's going to be now beginning moving into implementation as of this year. But I really feel I feel hopeful, and I tend to be a pretty critical person, especially of myself. But I feel hopeful in terms of how the approach that they're taking, that this might actually lead to some pretty different outcomes if people actually take this on board as they've intended for it to. If this actually is embraced.
What does that look like? What does implementation and outcomes look like in your mind as a most hopeful vision?
Well, I mean, I think that like so many of these things, I'll be excited by the time that this comes out. I think that the plan will then be public. So then, these
and we'll be
seeds,
linking to it in the show notes. Yes.
So these seeds will be in there, but I'll just give example. Like, one of the seeds that they have in the plan is slow down. It's about, I think that so much of the climate change conversation tends to be, sort of permeated with this notion that we need to, like, the sense of urgency. And definitely that, like, absolutely, I don't want to downplay that at all, especially for these communities who are on the front lines feeling this every day. Yes, there's a need for urgency. But I think that that urgency, it also, we don't make good decisions when we're caught up in this hamster wheel of how we've come to live, learn, and work. We don't make good decisions in that place. And I think so many of us are just trying to, like, survive capitalism, like survive in this capitalist society, that we don't have that opportunity to slow down very often. But it's something that needs to be done. And so for those of us who are able to enable that space for people who do have that wisdom of how we need to move forward in a good way. There's a real need to enable spaces of healing and wellness, within our everyday institutions, like to enable decisions to be made differently, like just in terms of what we prioritize, in terms of how we navigate the daily, in terms of how we work together, like really collaborating in a different way, rather than this notion of competition that's been sort of put forward. That's something I really like about with River. We've been, and not to say that it's all been smooth sailing, but we've been really working together with different organizations, like each leveraging our unique things that we can bring to the table to co-create stuff. Like nothing's been, we share funding, we share everything, like really in terms of how we're creating things. And that's another one of the fellow seeds is work together. So yeah, they've got a number of these reconnection seeds that they have put forward in this plan, and a number of reconnection barriers that they've illuminated also in this plan. So I think that what that looks like moving forward, I think is, we'll be seeing some of those, we'll be having individuals and institutions, businesses, decision makers, like do some of this work, do this work to enable those reconnection seeds to be able to flourish.
And what are some of those barriers that have been identified?
I mean, I think a lot of these barriers to reconnection that they've identified have to do with the just sort of, it really connects with illuminating worldviews, but the things like the normalized sort of policies, like even within institutions, like things that tend to get prioritized over being in good relationship, right? So we tend to prioritize things all the time, like on the daily, that over being in good relationship with ourselves, like over being in good relationship with each other. And I think just it's a huge reconnection barrier that really is for these things, right? Like even if you look at a lot of the policies of institutions, they're to protect the institution, right? Like they're not actually centered on wellness of whomever they serve, right? Like I like to be able to get curious about these things, like together, in a way to enable the dismantling of these things. Because I think that there are so many better ways out there of how we could be doing these things that are specific to, like, localized to the places where we live too, right? Like to the, there are so many ways of governance, of education, of justice that, thrived within the homelands that we live on for millennia, that just have been suppressed, or like for so long, or that we still have, people from those places still having to validate like those ways of knowing, doing, and being for so long. And it's time, I think, for us to localize these things. Like these climate action plans should not all look the same. Like they shouldn't be this universal, solar panels and electric vehicles for everywhere, right? Like these should be incredibly localized climate plans, like specific to the knowledge and cultures of that place, the carrying capacity of that place, the distinct seasonal round of that place, the aspirations of First Peoples of that place, like they should be there's our way to, we can be doing so much better here in terms of localizing these things. And so what I'm excited for is that I think that what the fellows have put forward in terms of reconnection, the messaging of it is relevant right now to a lot of places, like if not everywhere, and so, but in can be tailored in its own way to each place. But I think we're all in need of reconnection in our own way right now.
Yeah. So well said. I mean, we in this interview series so far definitely seeing this common theme of emphasis on localization and local thinking and action, as well as kind of bioregional as a lens for planning and coordinating. And I was just down in Ecuador, and I was really enlivened by learning about this concept of life plans, this methodology that's been used for thousands of years by indigenous peoples in the Amazon to effectively plan and vision and dream into futures at a community level, and what those life plans can do to kind of roll up into more bioregional planning, and how that it's just a radically different paradigm for how we think about making decisions, working alongside one another, how we're in relationship with our forests and our watersheds and our food sources and our energy. And yeah, it does seem that there's space now for some fresh thinking. Like we have to, like, whatever we're doing right now is clearly not working. So just doing it faster is probably a recipe for disaster.
Yes. Well said. Super well said. Yes. No, 100%. And I think that most people actually are really hungry for these things. Like, I think that, despite all of our, differences and things, that I think that what I've been encouraged by, and, obviously in this day and age, like, your heart breaks every day in terms of, everything that's happening out there. And there's, a certain high level of cognitive dissonance that I think anyone needs to have to be able to feel content in any ways in this day and age, with all of the hurt happening out there right now. However, I do feel like there is increased momentum behind this movement. And I think what we've seen this week at Bioneers as well is like the convergence of so many movements in a space. There's momentum building. And I think, I do feel like people are hungry to come together in a way that at least I haven't noticed so far, or that I'm noticing more at this point in my life.
Yeah. Hey, what other reflections are you having here at Bioneers? What are you noticing, and how's the experience been for you?
It's been really good, all in all. I think I've appreciated so many of the keynotes were epic. I really appreciated what Jade Begay said in her keynote about the importance of celebration in movement building, about the importance of taking that time to celebrate little wins, big wins, and about how I think so many people working in different movements don't tend to do that. And because sometimes it feels like there isn't time to do that with everything else happening in life and the other needs emerging. But I think that I appreciated that. I appreciated too. It's been really special having two of the fellows from the Yukon, from where I was grateful to grow up, be here. And to be able to all experience it together. That's been really neat, and to see, to hear their reflections about it. And and just connecting with new people, new friends and old. I've learned I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot this last week, and yeah, but I think that I think sometimes, yeah, it's a good reminder that there are a lot of good people out there, who are trying to do the best they can with what they have. Yeah.
Nice. Are there any final reflections before we close that you would like to share?
Well, I just want to say thank you to Matthew. So I just want to take a minute to, like, none of this work is ever possible without people supporting it. And River wouldn't be if it wasn't for you. You were our first ever donor, and you gave to us in such a beautiful way. You trusted us.
We're going to cut this part out.
Okay, no. You trusted us. But yeah, you just trusted us in terms of funding us, that we were just going to do the right work, and you had belief in us. I think when we didn't even have belief in ourselves, actually. And I remember actually a few years ago, you pulling me aside and saying, like, nope, this, when I didn't think that I didn't know about being able to start my own thing. I felt very nervous about, going into the, Edmund Hillary Fellowship, becoming an entrepreneur and all these things, not growing up around that. And you were helped instill some belief, and then you acted on that by giving us the resources to be able to build the organizational infrastructure for River to even become a thing. So I just want to, also just hold you up and just thank you for that. We really care about you a lot, and we really, really appreciate you.
It's been an honor to be on the journey with you, Jodi. And thanks so much for saying yes to this conversation and joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Matthew. I usually you know how I am with Spotlight. I like to support behind the scenes. But I figured I thought this was important. So
well, I know people are going to love to hear your words and your voice, and I hope you continue to share it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I really am grateful to Jodi. She holds the work so humbly. To learn more, go to weareriver.earth, where you can also donate to their efforts. And to hear the conversation we had with Shauna Yaumans from Yukon First Nations about the Climate Action Fellowship, you can find a link in the show notes, as well as our conversation with Aaron Matariki Carr from River Collective. All of this and more is available at maearth.com. That's maearth.com. This is our first season. We'd love to hear what you think. Please like, share, subscribe, leave comments, and you can also join our community Discord. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.